good morning here in Taiwan, and good afternoon or evening other places. And thank you, for coming to this morning talk by Dr. Norbert Schorghofer. And the title is Lunar Cold Traps and Subsurface Vapor Diffusion. It's very interesting and very timely topic, I think, because there's a lot of attention to this issue of in situ resource utilization. And so we need to know much more about this basic principle of the water, ice, condensation, and volatiles stored in the cold trap. The Norbert, he did his undergrad in University of Vienna, and I joke that he did his undergraduate at the center of the universe, almost that. And then afterward, and he went to America, and you got your PhD at Chicago, right? University of Chicago.
Yes.
Right. Fantastic. And then go on to do his postdoc and continuing research at MIT and Caltech. And he told me that he has been working at Hawaii for the last 16, 17 years. So he's a real Hawaiian also at the center of the universe. Okay, so let's let Norbert then start his talk. I'm really looking forward to it. Please, Norbert.
Well, thank you for having me on this seminar series. During my time as a graduate student, I knew fellow students from Taiwan and learned a bit about the background of a country. But usually studied solid-state physics or electrical engineering or geophysics, which I learned are areas of local relevance, were also highly relevant areas for lunar science and exploration. So in this talk, I listed here some topics I'm hoping to cover. I don't think I'll manage to cover all of them. But that's sort of the outline of H2O cold traps, CO2 cold traps, microcold traps, sequestration of vapor pumping, and if I have a bit of time, also water exospheres. So here there is this old classical idea of why there should be water on the moon, and it really goes back to 1961 by Watson, Murray, and Brown. And there are some sources of water. We are not sure what the primary source of water is or how big it is, but there are certainly some sources of water. Then we believe they migrate. Water molecules migrate because at thermal speed, we're gravitationally bound, so they will hop around, and a fraction of them will fall into these cold traps in these permanently shadowed regions near the moon, near the pole of the moon, and so there should be ice accumulating in these areas. But this is all a theory by now. No part of this has yet been, proven to be really the case, but it has survived as a working hypothesis. So this may well be all true, but we haven't, proven it yet. Now, at the bottom, I list a review article which just appeared a few months ago that we wrote on some aspects of that, mostly the interaction of the water exosphere with the surface. And I will show, some parts of this review, but mostly I'll plan to talk about point 3, mechanisms of sequestering water on the moon. But the review actually mostly emphasizes point 1 and 2. So at least it's up to date, and it mostly summarizes results from the last decade. Now, the permanently shadowed regions and the cold traps, you have probably heard that many times in this seminar series. The axis tilt is small, so the permanently shadowed regions, and about 2/3 or so of these permanently shadowed regions are cold traps. So cold traps are defined by temperature. It's cold enough for even the sublimation rate into vacuum being negligible, while PSRs are defined geometrically. And very near the pole, PSRs and cold traps are almost the same. A bit further equatorward, various PSRs which are too warm to be cold traps, so they're permanently shadowed but not cold enough from reflected light. But in any case, there are very many cold traps on the moon, some large and some small. And one instrument which is sort of really important into quantifying the cold traps better is Diviner. So Diviner measures the surface temperature of the moon since 2009, and it still does so. So there is 12 years of continuous temperature data. And what's shown here is a temperature map of the peak temperature in the south polar region of the moon as 2010. So it was barely a year in orbit. So now we have 12 years. So we have a lot of data points, and we can make fairly accurate maps of cold traps for water ice and other volatiles. Now, another aspect, what Murray and Brown recognized, that among the common volatiles, what you expect to be delivered to the moon or be generated on the moon, water has the lowest sublimation rate. So other than elemental sulfur, or pure sulfur, I should say, which has even lower vapor pressure, H2O has a lower vapor pressure than SO2 or NH3 or CO2 and so on. So among all these common ices, so to speak, H2O will last the longest. And that's why, we think there's water ice on the moon. And at the bottom here, there is a specific number of, at 140 Kelvin, the sublimation rate into vacuum is about a meter per billion years, right? There's a meter per years, that's 1 nanometer per year, that's 3 monolayers a year. So that's about, residence times of 4 months. So, it's, often this is called the ice is stable, but it's really just a matter of a rate. There's no exact temperature threshold, but because the sublimation rate so quickly changes with temperature, one can almost set a threshold. The threshold is around 110, 120 Kelvin. And in fact, on this plot, you see, a 10 Kelvin change is a 2 orders of magnitude change in sublimation rate, which is, if we want to really delineate where the cold traps are, it all comes down to having accurate temperatures. You need accurate temperatures from measurement of models to really define our expectation where to find ice and where, it's no longer expected to be present. And so what you've done recently is, not just take the peak temperature, which is what anybody before had done, take the peak temperature because it is so sensitive to temperature, but actually just take the whole temperature dependence because we have so much data now. And here, this is just an illustration. If a temperature varies a bit, the sublimation rate into vacuum changes by a lot. And it still makes a difference whether one takes the maximum sublimation rate or the time average sublimation rate. So we really were calculating the time average sublimation rate for the first time for the moon. And in particular, the moon has seasons, which are not negligible. So the seasons are very low amplitude, 1.5 degree change in the height of the sun, declination of the sun. And the relevant year is a draconic year, which is 347 Earth days. Right? The orbit of the moon is actually complicated, right? Because the sun pulls on it too. But that's what ends up happening. So there's these seasons, which, for most of the lunar surface are negligible. But in the cold traps is actually significant. So here is actually Diviner data from cold traps. So which, 40 Kelvin, 60 Kelvin, that's how cold they get. Harbor of Amundsen. And it actually varies with seasons. We see, we can measure the temperature changes with not just the time of the local time of day, the lunation, but also with season. And here is a more, sort of quantitative map of a seasonal temperature amplitude to the diurnal temperature amplitude. Based on, at the time, 11 years of surface temperature measurements. And the green areas, which are cold traps, some of the cold traps, the seasonal amplitude is actually bigger than the diurnal amplitude. So it's one cannot neglect the seasons if one accurately wants to quantify the sublimation rate or potential sublimation rate in these cold traps. And so recently, just last year, the Diviner team, made these maps where you take all the available Diviner data and bin them into diurnal bins and seasonal bins. So the results I'm going to show today are 24 diurnal bins and 6 seasonal bins for 144 bins. And this data, of course, are available online too. And then we take this, and for each of these time bins, calculate a sublimation rate, then average the sublimation rate, get sort of an accurate number for the long-term sublimation rate, right? Because it's we talk about billion-year time scale. So we want to know the sublimation rate averaged over a billion years. So we average over 11 years here, but the lunar spin axis hasn't changed that much. So and one ends up with this map here, the most recent, sort of up-to-date, most accurate map of cold traps in a south polar region on the moon. And they're about 25% larger than what one would obtain just using a peak temperature, which is all the previous work. And so now we're talking about 17,000 square kilometer. Also, I have to add the cold trap area depends on the resolution, which is another interesting point I will also get into. But at this resolution, which is sort of what Diviner can accomplish, because the footprint is a few hundred meters, we have a 17,000 square kilometers of cold traps, whereas the area of permanently shadowed regions is about a third bigger than that, almost, well, not twice, but a third bigger or so. So most of the PSR areas are cold traps, but not all of it. So the color here, I should say, that's the logarithm of the time average sublimation rate. So if that's below what they expect to be the amount delivered to the moon, which may be 1,000 kilograms per square meter per gigayear, or maybe it's just 100 kilograms per square meter year per square meter and gigayear, it doesn't make all that much of a difference in area actually. Anything which is blue or green has a negligible sublimation rate. And we also think the exosphere delivers this to the polar regions geographic uniformly. So there's no rain shadow effect or so from this ballistic hopping. So it's the delivery we theoretically expect to be fairly uniform. So all these cold traps should have some ice, and there are other loss mechanisms potentially, but sublimation loss is one of them. Now one can apply the same analysis to other volatiles, right? So here's again sublimation rate as a function of temperature. This is a more recent compilation of what these sublimation rates look like, which are, by the way, all extrapolated to lower temperature because they can't be measured in a lab too low, but you just assume a constant latent heat and extrapolate the lower temperature. And here again, there's H2O, and then there is SO2 and NH3 and CO2. So CO2 is sort of on a lower end of about at the lowest temperature seen by Diviner. So there are areas which are 50, 60 Kelvin, but not that many. So it's interesting, and carbon dioxide is also interesting because if you radiate carbonaceous ices, you build up organics. So it's sort of an interesting process of what organics there might be present. And then it has a significance for ISRU because if you need rocket fuel from methane and liquid hydrogen, which I understand what the SpaceX engine is going to do, you need carbon. So you need methane, which you need carbon for that because methane itself is not cold trapped. It might be absorbed, but it's not cold trapped. It's too volatile for that. So carbon, and then you can also, these days there is biomaterials. So carbon is sort of an essential resource on the moon, or for many things, but it's scarce on the moon. So the question is there really carbon on the moon? Are there carbon dioxide cold traps? And so we applied the same technique to really making accurate maps of carbon dioxide cold traps. And then there's also, I should say, there's like coronine which it could be generated from radiation products, is very stable. So there are some sort of heavy complex molecules which you would expect to be cold trapped easily on the moon or even on Mercury. And anything less volatile than H2O goes under the name of super volatile or hyper volatile. In the common literature, it seems to be called hyper volatile for the moon, or you should call them super volatiles, but it's the same concept. And so one interesting place to really look at sublimation rates and temperature is the L-cross impact site. And so the L-cross impact site, there was this artificial impact in 2009. And the plume came in sunlight, and then a spectrometer to look at the gases in the plume. And they did detect, first they detected H2O, which is the most direct evidence we have of that there is indeed water ice in the cold traps of the moon, although it's only like 6% or so. But it also detected CO2. So it was CO2 at this site. And indeed, it is a CO2 cold trap. So here are the 144 bins, like 6 times 24 time bins, with all the temperature, bin temperatures in there on the upper left panel, and then the sublimation rates calculated from them. So the sublimation rate, and then it's the log of the sublimation rate. So even though it's the log, you see the 2 pixels basically dominate the whole sublimation rate, right? So in summer at a specific local time, the sublimation rate goes out to 1,000 kilograms per square meter per billion years. And that, that might be more than CO2 than has ever been delivered to the moon. It's just 12 kilograms per square meter per billion years. And that's a very realistic amount. So, this spot is a CO2 cold trap. And indeed, CO2 was identified. So that gives us some confidence that these maps relate to reality. And then, I already said that, right? So this is a zoom picture, zoom map of the sublimation rate, CO2 sublimation rate now in Capello's crater, where L-cross impacted and indeed found H2O and CO2 and other species. And nobody can explain the relative abundance of these species. That's an unsolved problem, but at least we know they're there. And here now is a map of CO2 cold traps. So the water ice cold traps are the black contours, and the CO2 cold traps are the colored areas. So, the CO2 cold traps are, much, much smaller, but there are contiguous regions. In particular, this one big area and the floor of Amundsen crater is a third of the entire cold trap area. So the CO2 on moon, which is likely an important resource, we expect to be concentrated in just a few areas, right? So the moon is a big place, but there is some areas which are much more important than others for ISRU. And if we had only taken the peak temperature for this cold trap map of CO2, we would have ended up with 60 square kilometer, just a few pixels. Whereas if we do the whole time dependence and the time average sublimation rate, it's 200 square kilometer, right? So here it was really important that we consider the entire time dependence, not just do a peak temperature. And so, there's some hope that there's actually concentrated carbon in there, which we could use for various purposes. Now, am I good? Do you still hear me and everything? Because I can't see anyone. So then there's this concept of micro cold traps. So what it is, right? So there are shadows on all scales, right? So, and this picture here, these photos here, show shadows from, picture A was taken from orbit by camera, and C is sort of microscopic, almost microscopic image, I guess. And so there is, like for any natural landscape, sort of a fractal hierarchy of topography and therefore shadows, and therefore you expect this also translates to permanent shadow and also ultimately translates into cold traps, right? And if this water is delivered through the exosphere, entire polar region, then even the small cold traps should contain ice. And the significance is exploration, right? Because the big cold traps are difficult to explore because either you have to land in a cold, permanently dark area, which is difficult, or you have to drive into a big crater, which is risky. So if one has a small cold trap, I don't say 10 centimeter, one could just drive up with a rover, right, and observe what's inside. So from an exploration perspective, these might be hugely useful. And what we tried is to just quantify how many of these are there really. But how do you do that? Because, like temperature data, we have only global temperature data. We only have a resolution of a few hundred meters per pixel. Now, images with high resolution, but images just give us instantaneous shadows, not permanent shadow, right? So what we did is take all this data, high resolution photos, diviner data, and study them as a function of spatial resolution, and also take the topography itself and study its fractal exponent and so on, and extrapolate it down to smaller scales, right? And the hardest part of that is to do it. These data sets agree with each other, so convert instantaneous shadows into permanent shadow based on image data and theory, use diviner data to get temperatures, extrapolate them down, and have a statistical model of a surface at small scales, which can reproduce its properties. And I think we started in 2014 or so, and finally published it in 2020. So in a short paper. So it took a while, but we tried to quantify the abundance of cold traps. Now, I do a lot of theory, so I like to look at this from a theoretical perspective. There's something called the fractal photomatic paradox. It's a term I picked up from a paper in Petrov et al. 2003. So what it refers to is that if you go to higher resolution, the area of a shadow always increases, right? And the way, for natural landscape at least, and the way I make sense of this is, if you look at the shadow of a large hill, like here at the bottom, a continuous shadow, if you look at it higher resolution, it's still a continuous shadow. But in addition, you're going to have small craters where you also start to resolve the shadows. And therefore, the fraction of the area which is shadowed increases with finer resolution, right? And it's called, it's called paradox, just like, Zeno's paradox of Achilles and a turtle, which is, it's just saying that a infinite series can have a finite limit, right? So meaning that, although the shadowed area increases with finer resolution, it doesn't mean all of it is shadowed, right? It's a paradox only at this trivial level, but it attaches a nice name to it. And it's really for shadows and for natural landscapes. And, it's just sort of, I guess, a reasonable assumption to say that also translates to PSRs and ultimately cold traps. And so that's sort of what we ended up with, sort of a quantitative estimate of a number of cold traps. There was a lot of data that went into it, but it's essentially a model of a small-scale statistical topography of the moon constrained by a lot of temperature data and a lot of image shadows extracted from images, and theories which connects relativity to quantities. And a PSR areas just becomes, larger. A number of PSRs here gets larger and larger and larger with smaller scales. The cold traps eventually because of lateral conduction, there's a minimum size to the cold traps, which by itself is a really important question on how small a cold trap can be. So it may actually be as small as a centimeter. And in that case, we have, 10 billion cold traps on the moon, 10 billion cold traps of centimeter size and so. So that's a lot of potential sites to visit. Now, to finish this thought here, the very small cold traps also younger, right? Because they're results from impact and so on. So they don't necessarily have as much ice as the big cold traps, but still they should have some ice. Now, so how small can a cold trap be? So the way we try is to answer and to at least get some handle on this number is to just solve the heat equation in a cylindrically symmetric geometry. It's just the Laplace equation. And we have some measurements of a thermal conductivity of lunar dust from Apollo samples. So we brought back with samples and measured the thermal conductivity. And it's very low, right? So about 0.01 watts per meter Kelvin, right? If you take a rock or ice, the conductivity is 2 or 3 watts per meter per Kelvin. So this is easily 2 orders of magnitude less. And it makes sense because, there is, at low temperature, the radiative heat transfer is negligible. There's no interstitial air to conduct anything. And the smaller the grain size, the less contact area there is, it turns out, right? So granulated material has a lot lower conductivity than a bulk material, and smaller the grain size, the less conductive it gets. So these are extremely good thermal insulators. I call them out of this world thermal insulators sometimes, because they're sort of the best, cold vacuum environment with low grain size. That's sort of the best natural thermal insulator I can think of. And with these numbers, one ends up with very small sizes, like even a centimeter, right? So they might really be that small. And so, we had a. I think if the fixed temperature boundary condition, one can even solve this analytically. But if a radiation boundary condition, we had to do it numerically. So we just assumed, some disk, which is, shadowed and only has reflected light, for which we have an estimate. And then there's the area outside, which gets the sunlight. It has to do with a function of latitude and so on, of course, but it provides some estimate of a minimum size of cold traps. And so, one ends up with this, conclusion. If one explores the moon with a rover, one can go and seeks to find ice. One can go to many places and doesn't have to go into one of these large, dark areas. And so the next 2 years, you're going to see several, rover missions to the moon, Prime 1, Moon Ranger, Viper, which carry instruments to detect water and land in the south polar region of the moon. And Prime 1, I guess, is stationary, but Moon Ranger and Vipers are rovers. And I believe Chang'e 5 is also going to the south polar region as a lander. And Lunar, either Lunar 25 or 26. So there'll be plenty of missions. Now, but there's more than cold trapping to the sequestration of water. And so first of all, there is water, tiny amounts of water detected in Apollo samples. Now, the thing with Apollo sample analysis is always contamination, right? But by now, it's sort of been shown that, for example, inside glass beads, right? These glass beads which are formed from impacts can actually find at least some hydrogen, but there are tiny amounts, but it's there. Overall, the moon is extremely dry. So we're talking about 10 ppm of water and so on, right? Now, if you have adsorption, right, which is a surface phenomenon of having a molecular layer, you get maybe 100 ppm of water, right? But for macroscopic amounts of water, that's what we have cold traps for. And there is, that's ice exposed on a surface. It can be small or large. If it's buried, right, if it happens to get buried by, say, impact detector, then it will last even longer. But it's, it will be very rare that ice gets deposited and then quickly buried. But in principle, buried ice could last longer. And then, but then there's another way of sequestering water, which is entirely theoretical, but at this point, but should happen. And that is, if a subsurface is a cold, the surface is not a cold trap, but the subsurface is. So suppose the subsurface has 100 Kelvin, but the surface itself heats up to 140 Kelvin at some point, right? So it's not a cold trap on a surface because at peak temperature, all the water molecules are gone. But water molecules can diffuse through this layer. And if they reach the permanently cold layer beneath, then it will stay there forever, basically. And so it's called vapor pumping. And it's an idea which is really invented for Mars in the 90s, and we believe it's important on Mars. And I explored it for the moon, and it should work on the moon. It's very inefficient on the moon, but it should work to some extent. And as part of that, one really wants to understand the residence time of water molecules on these lunar grains. Now, that's a hard problem because, the top 100, so these are, silicate grains, and the top 100 nanometer are amorphous from all the radiation bombardment and perhaps other processes. And so the top 100 nanometer, very complicated layer. And we really have a very limited understanding of how they interact with water molecules, or how water molecules get generated in the surface layer, which also happens, we now know, starting with solar wind implanted protons. But anyway, so to look at actual data, there are absorption isotherms measured for a lunar sample, basically just one lunar sample. But it has been done, so we measured the amount absorbed, and we also measured the specific surface area of that lunar sample. And basically, what's the vapor pressure as a function of the amount absorbed. So at one monolayer, the vapor pressure is about 20% that of ice, right? Which means residence time of these molecules is 5 times longer than it would be on ice, right? So it gives us some idea. Now, some have argued once you go to theta equals 0 to almost no absorption, that there's going to be chemisorption and they're never going to leave the surface again. But again, that's purely a theoretical argument, basically at this point. And there is a lot of work, I think, left to be done to quantify the residence times at these very low H2O concentrations. But it's certainly at monolayer and above, there's at least some measurements, and that's what I used to quantify this residence time and figure out how fast these molecules diffuse through the lunar soil, which has a lot, is basically dust in many places, to reach this cold, permanently cold area. Well, to reach say 10 centimeters depth, at which pace the peak temperatures would be damped out. And this here is an illustration of what these residence times are as a function of temperature, and they critically depend on temperature. So and there are various, let's see, so at 110 Kelvin or so, right? We are talking about residence times of 1 billion. Well, no, it's 110 Kelvin. We are talking about residence times of months, actually. So at the bottom it says intergram time of flight. So this is whatever 100 micron or a millimeter, space you have between these dust grains. So the dust grains are, typically 100 micron on the moon. And so below 250 Kelvin, the time of flight is negligible compared to the residence time. So it's still sort of a random walk diffusion process, but it's no longer dominated by the time of flight, which we, that's what usually read about in textbook on random walks, the diffusion of a gas in the Knudsen regime in a porous medium. But it's actually dominated by residence time, absorption residence times. It's still a random walk, but it's just that most of the time on grain surfaces instead of in flight. And so on this next slide here, now this is an illustration of how this pumping down of the vapor. So I call it pumping because there is, there are no temperature cycles, the monthly temperature cycle. And when it gets warm, these molecules can move down or up, right? But there's an interesting dynamical phenomenon in that there's a preferential trend downward. And let me try to explain how this works. So the flux of the vapor is, minus the mean free path times the gradient in the sublimation rate or desorption rate, E being this desorption rate basically. And the reason why, right? If you have two surfaces, opposite of each other, the flux between these is going to be a flux from one to the other minus in the opposite direction, right? And so the difference becomes that derivative here. And so that's just and I'm thinking about this one-dimensional. It's obviously a three-dimensional process, but it has to start somewhere. So in one dimension, that's like this one-dimensional diffusion law, which is still valid even in vacuum, in a porous medium, in a Knudsen regime. Now, a great thing is that we can time average that, right? So if we average that flux, that time average, the time integral goes through to the time average of the adsorption flux, right? So that's of great help, because this whole diffusion, microphysical diffusion, has a lot of things that can go on. But the long-term average, we just need to look at the time average of the desorption rate. And then, we can look at a time average of the desorption rate, say, on the surface, and at some depth with, suppose has ice, right? And find that, so suppose we had water all the time on the surface, and suppose you had water anytime, all the time at a particular depth. If you time average that sublimation rate, it's much higher on the surface, because the sublimation rate as a function of temperature is a convex function. And the average of a convex function is always higher than the value at the average temperature. And so there is a net drift inward. Well, if there is enough water on the surface, there is a net flux inward, right? So these cycles, provide a way of pushing water into the ground, which would not be nearly as fast if there were no temperature cycles, right? So if we out temperature cycles, if we just had 100, 110 Kelvin all the time, that migration inward is so slow that the amount which accumulates at depth is entirely negligible. Right? But with these temperature cycles, there's actually pumping into the ground. So there is some fraction of ice, of buildup of ice in the subsurface if it's cold enough. And here is a phase diagram of what sort of good temperature conditions are. So mean temperature versus peak temperature. And the mean temperature is below 120 Kelvin or so. Sorry, when the peak temperature is below 120 Kelvin, we have cold traps. In that case, we have ice anyway. Turns out cold traps, there's very little pumping. There is pumping, but it's very weak. And what I'm plotting is a difference between the desorption rate on the surface based on a time-dependent model of the surface population of the water molecules and the vapor pressure of ice at depth. Now, if the mean temperature is too high, even at depth, they will not stay around because they're too mobile. And so the conditions for where you really have sequestration of ice, so this is water molecules delivered to the surface, migrate down to this pumping effect, and then accumulate and build up in a subsurface at depth. So you don't see that on the surface, you only see in the subsurface. So this is mean temperatures less than 110 Kelvin or so, but peak temperatures above 110 Kelvin are great conditions for pumping, right? Now, that gives us a condition for whether it happens or not. I've tried also to estimate the absolute amounts of how much water one can expect, and it's probably just maybe a 1% volume percent of water. I mean, it depends greatly on how much water was delivered to the moon. But if you deliver a meter of water in 1 billion years, which is a realistic estimate, then we are talking about a few volume percent of water at depths below the diurnal skin depth. So these are depths of a few centimeters and beyond, where this would build up. And here's a map, which we just made an update of this map just last year, using all these detailed diviner temperature, surface temperatures we had analyzed from the cold traps anyway. And so the area where pumping is significant, we estimate is almost 100,000 square kilometers. It's 5 times larger than a cold trap area. So there should be subsurface water ice in these regions. So that's entirely a prediction at this point. This hasn't been observed yet, but of course, neutron spectroscopy has seen lots of hydrogen access in the polar regions, which correlates very well with low temperatures. But it's a theory. It's at this point a theory, which is not a sequestration mechanism entirely different from a cold trap. It happens outside cold traps. And so so this gives an overview of types of ice storage. There's cold traps, which is smaller than PSRs. Then there is well, I only briefly mentioned that. So there's this idea of if you bury ice quickly enough, it will stay around for a long time, but it's a very rare, you need very conditions of very low probability. but certainly the area where buried ice would stay around is very large. And then there's vapor pumping. And these circles here actually sort of quantitative. So in this schematic diagram, so there's a cold trap area. The area of cold traps for super volatiles is much smaller. Depends what super volatile we look at. But CO2 area is certainly small. It's not zero, but it's certainly small. When the PSR area, cumulative area, is a bit larger, third larger, so when all the cold traps. Then there's a huge area where buried ice could survive if it was buried quickly, but that's probably rarely the case. And there's significant pumping, the green circle here, where some fraction, it's macroscopic ice, not just absorbed water, but 1% would be macroscopic ice, right? 100 ppm on the borderline of absorption, but 10,000 ppm would be a lot of water ice actually. And the other, there is the other carriers of hydrogen, absorption or non-volatile H2O are interesting too, but they occur at much lower concentrations in the solid regions of the moon, and will also, don't really take part in the present-day water cycle. They don't supply the exosphere, they can't be, and so on. So that's why I think ice is a particularly interesting form. It's highly concentrated and it's volatile, so it actually takes part in the current water cycle. All right, now I am, let's see, I actually got as far as water exospheres. I should leave room for questions, so I'll just talk a bit about water exosphere. So water exosphere is what we hope or think supplies the polar regions with water. And the escape speed of the moon is 2.5 kilometers per second, where typical thermal speed of water is, well, it depends on the surface temperature, right? But it's 600 meters per second or so. So they're definitely gravitationally bound, and they photodissociate. But it actually, on average, I think they undergo 100 hops before they photodissociate or fall in the cold traps. So that's a lot. The big uncertainty with that theory, so we can model all this, the biggest uncertainty with that is, what really happens when a water molecule touches one of these extremely dry amorphous silicate surfaces. And, our estimates of residence times are reasonable, and do they really leave at thermal speed rather than something else happening, rather than being chemisorbed or being ejected in a more violent way, and so on. And so we don't know the answer to that, but still the working hypothesis that nobody has disproven so far is that these move at thermal speeds. And the same happens on Mercury and Ceres. So Ceres, was studied in detail by the Dawn spacecraft for a few years. And the escape velocity of Ceres, I think about 0.5 kilometers per second. So, it's a significant gravity. A lot of them escape after a few hops, but it's significant gravity. And I have noticed that the first model simulation of a water exosphere on Ceres, at least of this type of hopping molecules, was done by Tu et al. in Taiwan. So this is, and there have been a number others since, but Tu et al. Really pioneered this work. And these three globes really show the actual output of model calculations. This is random hopping of one water molecules each on these globes. So this is about how often they hop before they escape, and that's the actual size of these hops compared to the size of the globe. And then one can use this, models of the exosphere to make many various predictions, such as, the geographic distribution of influx to the poles, which I probably mentioned earlier was essentially uniform. So there's no rain-shadow effect because the hop length of these molecules is a few hundred kilometers, whereas the cold traps are smaller than that. So they hop over cold traps. They're not blocked by cold traps. This diagram here shows the fraction of cold traps, fraction of molecules which actually end up in the cold traps. And you know, the more cold trap area there is, the more there are trapped. But as a function of cold trap area, right? So the colors are different bodies, and the shapes are different species. So the round circles of the moon. So for the moon, the round circles of our water, and the blue round circles of the moon. So 10% of water molecules expected to end up in cold traps. So it's quite a big fraction, right? And CO2 on the moon, the blue star, is even more efficient because the photodissociation lifetime of CO2 is longer than that of H2O. And so it hops and hops and hops, doesn't get destroyed. So a huge fraction of the CO2 molecules should end up in a cold trap. So that's another reason why these CO2 cold traps should actually contain a significant amount of CO2. And then, you know, one can do the same exercise for Mercury and Sirius and so on. But the moon, in some ways, is actually very efficient in trapping these species. And then, so the perhaps, you know, greatest evolution in our thinking of the origin of water on the moon, and this is a long story, which is treated in greater detail in our review paper, which I mentioned early on, is that some amount of water is generated by solar wind. And so this plot is a LADI instrument. There's a mass spectrometer which flew around the moon for half a year or so. And it couldn't distinguish H2O from OH. But other than that, it's a water group detection. We found water coming off the moon, water, either H2O or OH, a water group species coming off the moon. And they found it coincides with meteorite streams, and the amount of water exceeds the amount of water which could have been contained in these meteorites, which really shows that there is water generated on the lunar surface, and it comes off during meteorite streams. And the way this probably works, and again, this is a theory at this point, the way it probably works is that solar wind protons get implanted in the top 100 nanometer of the silicate grains. They form OH, and then sit around in OH form until they're hit by a meteorite. And the heat generated by meteorite, these temperatures of, 1,000 Kelvin or so, are high enough to recombine with OH and form H2O, and that then leaves the surface. So that's that is happening to some degree, I think, on Mercury and the Moon. But there's very limited observation so far. This is pretty much the best observational constraint here from LADI, what we have of at least there is a water group exosphere on the Moon that we know. But for more of that, it's in a review paper. But there does appear to be this ongoing source of water, which on the Moon we do not know at all whether that's the dominant source of water in the cold traps that's open. It might not be, but at least that source seems to be there. So to summarize this, well, so cold traps is where we all hope to find water ice in the upcoming missions to the south polar region of the Moon or north polar region of the Moon. But there are certainly many more to the south polar region to the Moon. And the most accurate way to quantify them is to not just use peak temperature, but use time average sublimation rates. So we have better maps of these now. And in particular, the map of CO2 cold trap now shows, real contiguous areas rather than just, a few pixels one would have to worry about whether there's a noise or not. So I think there definitely are CO2 cold traps on the Moon and in a few select areas. There are cold traps at many scales, probably billions of them. And a few of them will hopefully be explored by the upcoming missions in the next few years. And then there is this idea of vapor pumping, which can act outside the cold traps to sequester some of the water into a subsurface. So still in cold areas, but not as cold as cold traps. And finally, let me say that AOGS will be in Honolulu in 2022. the conference, and there will be a session on lunar volatiles. And I hope I see some of you in person in Honolulu next year at this conference.
Okay, thank you so much, Norbert. That's a very, very, very detailed. I mean, you talk a lot about microphysics of of the ice condensation, which is really exploring the, how to say it, the unknown frontier, as far as I can tell. I mean, usually I use a very global description. So anyone in the audience have questions for Norbert? I mean, there's a good chance to just any question, ask him. I have a couple of questions, but I will let you ask first. There are many of my colleagues here coming here just to listen to you and to learn more things. So I have a question. I mean, a couple of questions. The first one is that do you know about must know about the Chandrayaan-1 mission, right? And they have a probe. I mean, they have a probe going to the pole, the lunar pole, and they published papers saying that they find that there's how to say it, they have a layer, exosphere compositions. And do you have any thought about that?
Well, do you mean Chase on Chandrayaan-1, or you mean?
Yeah, Chandrayaan-1, yeah.
Yeah. So this was a one-shot mission, right? They sent this probe and found an abundance of water, which is extremely high, much higher, many orders of magnitude higher than was when the limit from the Apollo mission, as well as what Ladi measured. And then they down-corrected it, right, by several orders of magnitude, which I think is still way above the limits by our instruments. So I think because it was a one-shot measurement, and the numbers are higher than what limits put on by others, it's not a widely accepted measurement. So I think that's the so yes, but if they are right, they are if they are the first ones who have measured it. So
okay.
But I think abundances are just too high to just be accepted.
Yeah, it's not just water. They also detect some other things, so that there's.
I think the other species are. I'm not up to date whether they're, but I think they are not controversial. But the water is probably controversial. Yeah.
Good. One of the main topics, one of the main points in your talk is about the CO2. The CO2. You're right that now I think that your explanation that why the CO2, the trapping efficiency is high, is because it has a very long lifetime. On the other hand, it has to find its right place to settle down, to condense. How does that two things balance?
Yeah, but so if it hops off enough, it will eventually find its places, right? So,
okay, all right, you're smart.
So it makes sense. Yeah.
So the other thing is that you talk about the microcold traps, and basically how big are they?
Well, they are at all scales down to maybe a centimeter. It depends what the lateral
centimeter.
Yeah, I mean, from a nomenclature, in terms of the terminology, I think at this point, micro refers to anything which diviner cannot resolve. Right? Diviner would be 100-meter resolution or so. So that's we call it micro, but it's I think the term micro is negotiable. But they should occur in all scales until the lateral conduction takes over, which may be as low as a centimeter, or some have argued even less than a centimeter. Yeah.
Okay, the thing is this, because if you talk about how, so to say, the normal cold trap or macro cold trap, so to say, and we tend to see that there's a lot of those water ice should be buried, stored under the surface, and being protected from the meteor impact. However, for your micro cold traps, they're small, therefore they're very, very shallow, so they must be constantly subject to micrometeor bombardment. and that tend to have frequent gardening effect or heating, right? And then that tend to, how to say, burn the water ice away.
Yes, so there are other loss mechanisms. Meteorites are one of them, and you might be right. So at this point, we don't know how much of that water is left. Now, one argument I've given recently is, look, it's Ceres. Ceres has been bombarded for over 4 billion years, and there is still water ice, certainly within a few decimeters of the surface, from a dawn neutron spectroscopy. So the ice on Ceres has somehow survived all these impacts. And so, it's not clear whether these impacts are really that bad, because they also bury some of the ice. They don't necessarily destroy it. So, I'm not sure this meteorites really destroy that much ice.
But, Ceres is basically water rich, 25% made of water, so that, much of the water could have been sublimated from below, right? I mean, it's not like the moon.
Yes. Mm. That's true. Ceres water comes from below, not from above. So, I think this is a very valid point. We don't know how much. So I think I only talked about thermal. I only talked about sublimation. There are other loss processes, we try to quantify, but there's a lot of uncertainties left. Yeah.
I mean, some of the very interesting things you talk about, it would be very nice to have some laboratory experiments. The control experiments. You must know Norbert, right? And
yes.
and Gunther Cargo in Graz. Do you think you could convince them to do some experiments for you?
Well, I don't know them enough.
You don't know them enough. Okay, I could tell them about your idea, because Cargo, they both were my postdocs at Lindau. So
yeah, I'd be glad if we were willing to do such experiments.
So I have to introduce Austrians to Austrians. Good. Any other questions from the audience? I think it's there are many things to talk about, because Norbert is, I would say, he's currently the main person doing theoretical modeling of this kind of very complicated process. The trouble is that he's making more and more complicated, which is the right way. So you try to ask NASA to land on the microcrater, right? But that's not enough water for them.
Yeah, I mean the rovers will be within distance of. I mean, we're not landing on a microcold trap, at least not intentionally. They're gonna land close enough to go to.
Yeah, you just want to comfort them, say, but anywhere you go, you will get water.
Yes, and we'll see whether it's right or wrong.
So okay, good. I'm happy that you brought up the paper by Tu et al. Because we haven't done too much work since then, and then you have done some work, right, on Ceres, if I remember.
Yes. So I was on a Dawn team, and I've done some exosphere modeling for that. Now Dawn had no instrument to really look for an exosphere. Mm-hmm. So observationally, we know the context much better, but it's still only the terrestrial telescopes which have made some observation of water exosphere on Ceres. Yeah.
But Ceres, exosphere is in a way interesting and complicated by the finding of a water jet by the Herschel, right? By Herschel telescope.
Yeah. I mean, the water jet is inferred from modeling, right? So they see some water and then they infer the modeling. So that they're remodeling it now. They also might be reanalyzing the data. And my understanding is that these estimates will go down. So it's going to be some water, but a lot less than originally stated.
That's good news. Yeah.
I hear. I'm not involved in the work, but I think there's some work going on.
So we should ask Michael Kupers about that. He's the person who's doing the data analysis. Oh, there's a Lin Hong. You asked question. Mike, go ahead, please.
Okay, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, teacher. So I had 4 questions. So first question is we know the moon, sometimes there will be impact by the meteoroid or something tiny space rock. And when this meteoroid that impact to the moon and it will be degrade into the plasma cloud. So my question is can cold trap in the moon surface to collect this plasma cloud inside the ion or slower the speed or there is no effect for or they cannot still the plasma cloud cannot have any effect for this the cold trap.
Okay, one question at one time. So Norbert, do you understand the question?
Not quite. So we ask. So
you want to repeat it, Lin Qiong? You want to repeat it? Say it more clearly.
Oh, okay. So sorry. So my question is, we know when the meteoroid or something rock when they're from space and shoot and impact the moon surface, and they'll be degrading to a plasma cloud. Yeah. So my question is, can this cold trap to collect this plasma cloud in such the ion?
I see. Yeah. So I mean, the basic idea is that the source is elsewhere where a cold trap is, right? So we don't need to source a cold trap directly. If that lateral transport works, right, it could start from anywhere, right? So as long as any fraction of that plasma cloud, survives the impact, it's gravitationally bound, that fraction, and a fraction of that again would end up in a cold trap.
Okay.
So it depends on the speed as it impacts greatly, right? If it's a very high-speed impact, it will actually retain very little. But if it's a lower speed impact, it probably maintain more of the water, and that could happen anywhere in the moon, not right at the cold trap.
So
second question, Lin Qiong.
Okay. So my second question is, we know the moon inside the cold trap. Inside it has the crystal water or crystal carbon dioxide, and this is used very slower the rate to depositions in this cold trap inside. So my question is, we know the waters and the carbon dioxide, their density is different. The carbon dioxide is lighter and the water is heavier. But in the very slowest rate to deposition, this the step inside. Can this the water since the carbon dioxide appears the different layer, density layer, or they just be mixed?
Yeah, I mean, if they are delivered at the same time, they would be mixed. It's also possible that they form in amorphous state, right? Because the water ice transition, amorphous crystalline water ice transition is at about 140 Kelvin or so. It depends on the rate. But yeah, it could be layered, it could be mixed, it could again be mixed by impacts, and it could also be changed by radiation. So lots of things potentially happen, which I think should all consider. But basically, if it's delivered at the same time, it will be mixed. Density per se shouldn't matter much. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question is, so we know the cold trap is one small hole. Yeah, look like the craters in the moon surface. So that means in the different area of the moon, something cold trap, they're shallow inside, they will be not get any sunlight, so they're very cold. But their wall, maybe they be get sunlight, so very hot. So my question is the material, whether it's any material, their size will become bigger when they are get heat and smaller when they are cold. So this the effect is okay in kilometer, this the size, but like you say, it's the cold trap sometimes it's the meters to the centimeter. So in this small size inside, what effect of the is the thermal expansions and the contraction?
Yeah, I mean, so the indirect radiated light is scale independent, right? So at least if we just ask, so the main heat source in there will be reflected the scattered sunlight. So to estimate the temperature, the size, so at least the scattered part doesn't depend on size. But yeah, many other things will depend on size. Now, I mean, there are many material parameters involved, including expansion. But ultimately, you know, some parameters are far more important than others. And because the vapor pressure is so sensitive to temperature, really the absolute values of the temperatures are so critical, right? If a thermal expansion coefficient is different by 10%, 50%, you know, it's actually not such a big number. And I mean, much of it dust on the moon may even be generated from thermal erosion, right? From grains cracking under thermal tensions. And at this point, they have reached a small grain size. So I don't know, does it answer, does it address your question or?
Okay, so do this the thermal expansions and the contraction has any effect for the cold trap, the shape or the size? Can this the set become changed?
I mean, it's made up of loose material, right? So this is mostly dust, some rocks and dust. Okay. So yeah, it's loose. So it's granulated matter. It's the big blocks have already been destroyed from impacts and thermal cracking.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Norbert, this student has so many questions. Would you like to take him up as a graduate student?
Well, I'm at a research institute. We don't have students, unfortunately.
Oh, unfortunately, also that he still have 20 years to go before he could be a graduate student. Right?
But
okay.
Certainly, you know, coming to US for a few years is a great idea, great way to get immersed in this research. Yeah.
Right. Since Hawaii is so close to Taiwan, I mean, someday you should come visit us, or maybe we have a meeting and we invite you to come. You know, so we look forward to that day. Yeah,
I'd love to. I have not been there. But...
Okay, we will do that. Okay, Norbert, thank you so much. It's 10 minutes, almost 10 minutes past 10. So I will take up much of your time, and we hope to be able to invite you back, to give another talk on your more recent work. I mean, you must have plenty of things to say, plenty of things to say. So and I hope that we could do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye bye.